The consensus last year, in August, put together people coming from all over the world, and also colleagues from Spain, Italy, from Asia, from Africa, and of course from North America and South America met together. The consensus was a big event, and it gave the opportunity to talk and to share the knowledge across different countries. We had a roundtable at the European Bone and Joint Infection Society in Prague, where we met with Thorsten Gerke and Jay Parvisi, and we pointed out the advantages and the pros and the contras of this type of approach to our discipline. And I will briefly will go with you through it. The pros of this approach are many. It provides definitions and statements with regard to many gray areas that are still there in periprostatic infections. It also provided a picture of the current know-how and knowledge in the field. It also is a compendium that is easy to consult, it's easy to have for everybody, and quickly can be addressed. It also gave some indication for future research and was the chance to make a confrontation across different centers and countries. But to use appropriately the results of the consensus, we should also be aware of the limits. And I would like to mainly focus on this because these are often maybe not well pointed out, and I think on the opposite, that it is necessary that the scientific community knows about them. The first point is that the consensus used the Delphi method, a modified Delphi method, and Delphi method, the name comes from the Delphic oracle that was the most important in the classic world, was in fact developed in California by the Rand Corporation in the 60s, and the aim of the Delphi method was to establish a method to have an expert brainstorming, but systematic. The basis of the Delphi method rely on 3 points. The expert opinion should be received anonymously. There is an iterative approach, so that the questionnaire is first sent to all the experts, and then the experts make the answer, and then again, and again, and with this process, you finally come to a consensus. Then there is a statistical evaluation of results. The method was introduced mainly because this was funded by the Air Force in the United States to get an insight in different problems connected mainly with warfare. So, long-term threat, to forecast new technologies and the impact of new technologies on social and industrial environment. So the application was mostly in this idea and also for planning industrial development. Only in the last year, the Delphi method has been applied in the medical sector in the very different aspects, like in this paper applied to identify the most valuable orthopedic anatomy components to teach medical students, or to come out with a decision tool for chronic low back pain. The problem is that the Delphi method has never been validated as a decision-making tool in the medical sector and was not conceived, it was not intended to this use. The other problem with the Delphi method is that it relies on expert opinion, and we know that expert opinion is at the very bottom of the pyramid of scientific knowledge, because the intrinsic value, scientific value of expert opinion, since they may not be falsified easily, is very low. And even if the consensus comes from a multitude of expert opinions, it still remains an expert opinion, and it is not a scientific evidence in itself. The conclusion and the statements that are in the consensus are also prone to a problem. They can be interpreted as guidelines. And this has also a medico-legal effect that can be important. Papers and articles like this came out after the consensus meeting, and it was popularized, the consensus, as rules for treating periprostatic infections, but it is not. The problem is that when you have a number of scientific publications, in 6 months we have approximately 10 publications in the most relevant journals in the world, that is Clinical Orthopedics, Journal of Bone and Joint Surgery, Journal of Bone and Joint Journal, the Journal of Arthroplasty, all reporting the same, nearly the same articles. This forms a strong, strong body that is used as a reference, but there is no critics in it. They continue to repeat the same message. And which is this message? Is this scientifically sound? Not always. For example, question 1, what is the definition of periprostatic joint infection? Very easy. The consensus has defined periprostatic joint infection with 2 major criteria, or with at least 3 minor criteria out of 5. But why 3 and not 4 or 2? What is the scientific basis for identifying these minor criteria and not others? We don't know. If we look at the papers that have been published, we see that at variance to what is usually requested to our papers, when we submit a scientific paper, the level of evidence is not indicated, the scientific validation is not requested, and not presented. For example, question number 2. Do you agree with the American Academy of Orthopedic Surgeons algorithm to diagnose periprostatic infection? More than 90% agreed on that. It should be used every time you have a painful prosthesis. But which is this algorithm? I don't know how many went in detail across this. We have no time to do that now, but I will show you something. This is a long tree, and the root of the trees are that the conclusion is if infection is likely or unlikely. Now my question is simple. Is likely or unlikely a scientific measure? When I got married, now 20 years ago, it came out on the Independent, popular journal, an article in which they reported a conclusion of the British Psychological Society in which they stated that the pregnancy is more likely with lover than with fixed partners. So I was a little bit afraid because I got married that year, and I would like to have children. Luckily enough, in the next 2.5 years, I had 3 daughters. So I learned that maybe likely or unlikely is not something that is very scientific, fortunately. Also, Parvisi and Gerke, in the very, very last weeks, published an editorial now in which they probably understood the risk of proposing the consensus as a guideline to treatment. And if you read the editorial that they published recently in the Journal of Bone and Joint Surgery, you see that now they state that it should not be considered as a standard of care. This was something that we asked as a European Bone and Joint Infection Society to put in the preface of the consensus proceedings in August, but this was not accepted, but it is necessary to be known by the scientific community. Also, the consensus depends on how questions are formulated. This is something that the lawyers know very well. If you do a question like this, is there a role for routine sonication of the prosthesis? And you answer, no, we do not recommend the routine use of sonication. Then if you read accurately the answer, its use should be limited to cases of suspected or proven periprosthetic joint infection. So there is a role for sonication. But if you read this answer, you think, no, there is not. But if you change the question and you put in the question the positive part of this answer, and you ask, is there a role for sonication of a retrieved implant in all cases of suspected or proven infection without preoperative positive culture? The answer would have been yes. This has a strong impact on what people do or not do. Also, the answers are important. If you ask, should the patient and operatory room personnel wear a mask to avoid contamination of the air? And you put an answer like this, there is an absence of scientific studies that prove the need to use masks. But what is the consensus? The consensus is that until we don't have a study that proves that it is unnecessary, we continue to wear masks. So it's the same to say, if I say abracadabra every time I do a surgery, is it necessary or not? Until there is a study that proves that saying abracadabra is not necessary, I will continue to recommend to say abracadabra. Intrinsic in the Delphic method, there is that the consensus is on the lowest common denominator. If you pose a question like this, if knee arthrodesis is planned, should this be performed in a single or two-stage procedure? And you make an answer like this, the decision depends on the individual circumstances. What is the scientific knowledge of this kind of consensus? To say that you may choose if doing it one stage or two stage depending on circumstances, do we need this statement? And this? How long should suppressive therapy be administered? There is no consensus about the length, but we had 94 consensus on the fact that there is no consensus. And it is interesting to see that 4% disagree on the fact that there is no consensus. But a consensus of the fact that there is no consensus is a consensus. The last point is that consensus is not equivalent to scientific truth. Science is not democratic. Do you know this guy? This is Ignaz Semmelweis. In 1847, he recommended to wash the hands before in an obstetrical clinic in Vienna, because he saw that doctor wards had 3 times the mortality, infant mortality, compared to the ward run by midwives. But in spite of the presence of publication, especially from UK, in which they stated that it was important, the established scientific and medical opinion at that time and the medical community said that this was not the case. Semmelweis died 20 years later in an asylum for madmen. And only years and years after Louis Pasteur described the presence of the germs and Lister popularized the use of hygiene measures, Semmelweis' intuition was understood also in Central Europe. In conclusion, the consensus meeting provides an important, up-to-date, unprecedented insight on the current knowledge about periprosthetic infection, but mechanical and dogmatic application and its use for medico-legal purposes should be avoided. Identification of missing knowledge should lead to scientific research, because our goal is to achieve evidence and scientific knowledge. And the consensus should be regarded not as a point of arrival, but a big step forward in an ongoing process to achieve our scientific knowledge. Thank you very much for the attention.